Cool. Thank you guys so much for having me. This is really a thrill. I actually came from Guelph. I did my undergrad there, and so it's nice to be kind of returning to Guelph in some ways, my alma mater. So the title of my talk is Human Dimensions of Bird Women's Advocacy and Storytelling. Just to tell you a little bit about me for context. So I mentioned I did my undergrad in Guelph. I did a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. I was interested in becoming a veterinarian originally, and then having worked in a veterinarian, I discovered it wasn't for me. I took a bit of time off to do some volunteering before I started my master's degree in neuroscience at Western. I studied for my master's bird hearing, sort of interested in how birds and humans process the rhythmic organization of sound. And then I began my PhD in biology in 2019, and I'm still here, hoping to leave before not too long. Beyond that, I'm actually not a bird person. Like historically, I only really became interested in birds in the last couple of years. However, I've had pet parrots for much of my life. And I became interested in how birds experience their world through my pets. I have a lot of experience working in public facing roles. So I've had a variety of jobs working in customer service and volunteering. And I currently do a lot of volunteering in London's environmental sector. A lot of the advocacy work I'm going to talk about today wouldn't be possible without these community connections. So I think recognizing that community context matters. So for my PhD, I study the risk factors associated with birds flying into windows. And as I'm sure you all on the call are aware, this is an area of a lot of interest in research, as well as the public right now. A lot of this work is focused on like the cumulative impacts of window collisions on birds. So looking at like which type of species, which buildings. I'm much more interested in collisions at the individual bird level, like what is going on with a bird in the moments leading up to a collision, because I feel like that's really important for preventing collisions, is understanding the mechanism of how you get into a bird's head and get them to recognize, oh, this is a thing I can't fly into. So right now I'm doing an experiment. I can show you a video. We're developing a method for testing the effectiveness of different products for preventing window collisions, so glass treatments and glass types. For those of you who work in this space, you might recognize this as being similar to a flight tunnel in the United States operated at the Powder Mill Avian Research Center. We're working with a kind of similar paradigm, but hoping to make some improvements so that our tests are more ecologically relevant. So those are just house sparrows that I'm releasing. I also have been interested in studying window collisions in the wild. So here's a clip from a field study I recently completed where we recorded video of birds in a backyard setting passively interacting with glass, including collisions, but also cases where birds are avoiding the glass like this. And so trying to really understand like the mechanism of what's going on as a bird detects something and avoids it. And another part of my research, and this is probably what is most interesting to the group, is this business of conducting monitoring surveys of buildings and documenting the extent of the problem. And for me, having walked around and picked up all of these birds and many more, this is really what motivates me to do this work. This is about making sure that more birds don't end up like this. Of course, I have to do my research and publish it, and I'm interested in understanding the problem and contributing knowledge. But until we actually get out into the world and treat the windows, this is going to keep happening. And so I see my work as really needing to be applied in a meaningful way. And so the birds that you see here are ones that I found on our campus in 2019. It's actually only about half of the collisions that were detected over 30 weeks in that year. And this picture has helped me a lot with gaining traction to do some of the work I'm going to talk about today. I also track window collisions online. So you might be familiar with this Twitter account. It's called Bird Crashbot. I set it up with Flap Canada. And this basically searches Twitter every few minutes and pulls up tweets from people who've just reported that a bird hit their window. So often people will experience this and they'll think, oh my God, this is the weirdest thing ever, or they'll ask for help. And so this bot basically pulls in those tweets and it shares advice. So we put together this thread with comprehensive information, and we're actually approaching a milestone. This thread has reached almost 50,000 people. I think the bot itself has retweeted about 20,000 reports. So pretty interesting, and it gives me a nice window into the human dimensions that I'm going to be talking about today. So a lot of the advocacy work I've been doing has been concentrating on buildings at Western, and fortunately Western has agreed to retrofit their worst buildings based on data collected by myself and my volunteers. But I also do a lot of advocacy in the London community with municipal government and developers to ensure that new construction projects are not adding to the danger for birds, and also updating bylaw requirements for buildings. And then recently, we've undertaken advocacy at the provincial level and trying to get the Ontario Building Code to incorporate the CSA standard. So, you know, I have had a breadth of experiences interacting in this space, advocating and telling stories. And so, yeah, I'm excited to share my experiences with you guys. If I can offer anything useful, that would be a thrill. I work with a variety of organizations. I mentioned some in London's environmental sector, Nature Canada, Ontario Nature, FLAP. Acting as a liaison between these groups enables me to do all kinds of meaningful collaborative things and amplify mutual efforts. So I'm really privileged to have all the support. So basically what I want to talk about today are the human dimensions of preventing bird-window collisions. And what I mean by that is if we want to actually save birds and stop birds from crashing into windows, we have to recognize that this is really a problem for changing human behavior. And to be more specific, we need to change different humans' behavior. I'm talking about addressing and advocating to corporations, getting business owners to retrofit their windows that are killing birds, turning off lights, etc. This has an added impact of working in public spaces where people will see these treatments after they're applied. Homeowners, as we know, most bird window collisions happen at residential buildings, and those are not really covered by any laws requiring window treatments. So addressing that problem is really about soliciting voluntary participation from homeowners. And then people in government who make decisions about things like bylaws that require bird-friendly design, supporting programs for public education, etc. So I'm going to talk about these three today, these categories, and how to talk about bird window collisions to them. But there's also more to the story. You know, we also need to be having conversations with developers, with architects, retailers who sell products for preventing window collisions, and bird feeders, educators so that young people are aware of these issues. So it's a big movement, but the idea is that over time, if we have more conversations and we motivate more people, we'll normalize bird-friendly windows and glass, and we will achieve lasting cultural change. So this sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's possible. And I want to point to some success stories to kind of inspire us and remind us that even though this is a massive problem for society, we'll get there. We've seen similar cultural phenomena lead to behavioral change. So for instance, banning of DDT in the 70s has really helped bald eagle populations recover. You know, there's been huge reductions in the number of people who smoke cigarettes. Driving and talking on your cell phone with your hand at the same time is now taboo. We see lots of products now moving away from testing on animals. And as part of, you know, adapting to climate change conditions and reducing waste, rain barrels have become super popular where they weren't not so long ago. So these are all examples of where public education and data have kind of coalesced to produce these behavioral changes we want. And I think the same is possible for the way that we build new buildings and the way that we have and enjoy windows on our homes. We've got a lot of momentum. There's more and more people showing interest in this. And, you know, every week now, there's a new success story in the news like this one, where TD Center in downtown Toronto was retrofitted, I believe the largest project of its kind in North America. So the time for us to really make progress is now. This is a wonderful opportunity. I want to also offer a few disclaimers before I get into the specifics of advocacy. So what I'm talking about reflects my own experience, but it's very general. It's not prescriptive. The best way to advocate is always going to depend on the specific people involved. So you doing the advocacy, but also the people you're talking to. So always be sensitive to that. Values, sensitivities, and experiences of people vary really widely. Some types of advocacy will work well with certain audiences and less well with others. Every advocate has their own style, their strengths, their degree of comfort with this work, and everybody's advocacy is different. So what I mean is that the individual freedom to advocate intersects with your individual privilege. I'll be frank, there have been times when I've been scoping around buildings, walking around looking for dead birds, and I've wondered if my skin color didn't look like this, but I have a harder time operating in this space. And I think, unfortunately, the answer is yes. My freedom to go and walk up to somebody's front door and knock and talk to them, again, it is a privilege for me to be able to do that. So being mindful of just how to approach people and be sensitive around that is really important. And to people, you know, there's going to be social, economic, health related, other barriers that can make it difficult to advocate. So I think this speaks to the importance of really working together as a group so that it's not left up to any one individual to do the advocating. Instead, it comes from a collective. So we're going to talk about these three categories, audiences for advocacy. But before I do, I want to just offer some very general principles that I think apply to all three. So the first is that really this is about establishing key relationships and trust. If you want to convince people to do certain things, they need to trust you and be willing to listen to you. And in doing that, you really want to connect with their values. You want to find out what's important to them and try and relate the subject matter to that, because changing what people find important is a lot more difficult than identifying what's important and then striving in that direction. I recommend always demonstrating the problem and providing evidence. You want this to be a strong case that people can't just deny or fluff off, but you also want it to stand out in memory and, you know, be relevant to them. So showing them with pictures and providing statistics like the number of birds affected by their building, providing evidence of the problem. So if you find birds, and potentially even creating an experience where you take them for a walk or you show them a dead bird in your hand. Those are all things that can make or break a connection with somebody. You want to, again, make that information delivery personal. So make them accountable, you know, talking about how you live in the neighborhood or you work at this building or go to this school, that can also help. Addressing potential barriers to action. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but anticipating what kind of pushback you might receive. Why might a person be hesitant to retrofit their window? And addressing that head on can just make it easier for them to say yes. Being patient, realizing that these kinds of asks can be tricky and that this kind of change takes time, especially if you're dealing with corporations or a government. But with that said, don't be shy about following up. If you have a lead and you send an email and then you don't hear from them for a few months, don't be shy about writing to them again. That's totally normal. And always remember to try and be polite and compassionate and approachable. Again, going back to establishing relationships, you're not going to get anything done if they don't want to talk to you. And I know that having picked up a lot of birds myself, it's quite emotionally charging. You can feel really upset by it. And there's a place for that. You can use that to your advantage, but don't become antagonistic. Don't assume that the people that are responsible for making the change want this to happen. Usually people don't want to be killing birds if they can help it. So just keep a level head. Always recommend that. So we're going to start with talking about advocating to corporations. And this includes businesses, and also I'll talk a little bit about advocating at schools and campuses at the end. So I'm going to go through a few steps. First, you have to identify your goals. You want to collect a snapshot of the problem. You want to find and recruit supporters locally or internally to the corporation. You want to identify specifically who you need to convince at the corporation to take action and how you're going to get in touch with them. You want to provide evidence. So this is things like collecting birds and doing bird collision surveys. And then what I like to call applying the carrot and or the stick. So identifying goals. If we're talking about retrofits at an existing building, well, which windows are you talking about? Is it the whole thing? Are there certain windows you're concerned about? You want to be specific. Consider if maybe there is a role of lights being left on at night contributing to window collisions. So visiting the site at different times of the day can be quite informative. For example, this building at Western had window film applied. You can see the lift machine there, and it was still killing birds. And I learned it was because the lights were being left on in that corridor just behind the glass. So they installed an occupancy sensor and collision mortality dropped. So just exploring all possible factors, and consider doing a risk assessment. Fatal Light Awareness Program, or FLAP Canada, provides tools that can make it easy for businesses and yourself as an advocate to assess the risk at any given window. And another consideration is if you're asking a company to retrofit their building windows, maybe they're already doing maintenance on the windows and it can be tied together. So cleaning the glass or retrofits for energy savings, that kind of thing, just an opportunity to be aware of. There's also advocacy needed for new buildings. So again, which windows are we talking about? Is it the whole structure, or is it maybe windows that are just facing green space? You want to identify what the timeline is for planning and construction on the project. So that you can get a word in when it's actually going to count, ideally earlier than later. Figuring out who owns the building, and then figuring out also who's responsible for construction, who's planning, or so I guess involved with government oversight of the project, and who's the architect. These are all relevant details you want to identify early on. So you also want to collect a snapshot of the problem, because as you go about developing your advocacy, you're going to need to talk to people about this, and it's often easier to show them the problem than to just expect them to take your word for it. So doing some preliminary bird surveys yourself for walks around the building, even if it's just one person and irregular, that's fine. Documenting dead or injured birds with photos, and I recommend posting them online if you can to iNaturalist or birdmapper.org, which is run by FLAP. I would also suggest taking pictures of the windows themselves that you want treated. If you can highlight, take pictures when there's a really strong reflection or show the transparency, when you include those pictures later in correspondence, it'll be easier to make the case like, oh, look, this is the problem, and you can see it's a problem. And then, of course, checking databases for existing reports of bird collisions. You want to make sure that you're consolidating data and potentially aligning with other people who are interested in seeing retrofits happen. So this photo on the right, I took at a building on Western's campus. And this is another type of photo I think is quite useful because it shows the building and it ties, it tells a story, right? Like the birds were killed by that building. It is identifiable, it is linked to them. And in showing the birds in my hand like that, it's a powerful way of telling a story where the audience is put in your shoes, right? That could be their hand, for instance, or maybe, they've held a bird before and this really resonates with them. So taking a variety of photos can be quite helpful to you. Then you want to find and recruit supporters. So these can be people in your community or ideally people inside the corporation. I recommend reaching out to building maintenance workers. So people that are doing walks around of the building might find birds, and you can have them take photos and send them to you, or just generally be aware. And you can take that further and find an employee or an internal contact at the company. So I had tried a few different ways of doing this. It can be quite tricky on the outside to reach into a company and find the right people. You have to do a bit of sleuthing. So I created these business cards. This shows the front and the back. We also printed them as posters. And I basically went around on our campus to the bad windows and I stuck these with tape on the glass. and I put them up in like bulletin boards inside. And so within a few days, I was receiving emails from people at this account who were finding dead birds or who had worked there for a long time and heard the thuds and wanted to know how they could help. And so there are a variety of ways of passively collecting support as well. But even just walking around, and maybe somebody maintains a bird feeder on the property, or they've got a picture of a bird on their office door, like you might be able to find clues that suggest that a person would be sympathetic and willing to talk to you. I would also suggest reaching out to local nature and conservation groups or within academic institutions for contacts that can help you with the monitoring. So maybe there's students doing research projects for a course that would be willing to do some surveys for you. Or you might find support from people in the community like retirees who want to help conserve birds. Another way to do that is to participate in Global Bird Rescue, which is offered by FLAP every September and October. And that might help you to align with other people in the community who are interested and aware of FLAP's work and can, you can put your heads together and get more done. So then you need to identify specifically who you need to convince about retrofitting windows. So asking people internal to the organization is a really good way to do that. Um, you might want to reach out to people who work in sustainability or landscaping if they're available, particularly like academic institutions. Um, you can always check the website for the company and look at it like up in an employee directory that might give you a sense of who to talk to. Or you can try contacting a customer service or communications person and ask, who do I need to reach about a facilities problem? As you're going about all this, I recommend keeping organized contacts and notes on your correspondence. Even just a spreadsheet can be helpful. I have sent so many cold emails into the ether that I never heard back about. And sometimes you write to people and then months later you forget, did I already email them or not? Or maybe they've got multiple contact information pieces, and it's just really helpful to keep it organized, and it'll make it easier down the road. So then comes the work of producing evidence, and usually this takes the form of bird surveys. So this is going out and conducting regular monitoring of the building and then taking pictures and documenting collision mortality. Again, I mentioned using a platform like iNaturalist or Global Bird Mapper. I really like iNaturalist because it makes the species ID really easy. And it also gives you flexibility to send maps of the exact buildings or neighborhood to people if you want to. So for instance, on the bottom left, this was in an email I sent to a building manager for the building shown in the middle because they were interested in exploring a retrofit project. And the bounding box in orange allowed me to restrict my search to only records in that space, and then I can filter it down to birds that are dead. So as you can see, quite a few, but that's a really useful tool. You can embed hyperlinks to maps like this for specific buildings in correspondence. Or you can also present it as a grid. So on the right, you'll see the same map, but here are all the blue points shown as the individual photos of birds. As you're going about doing monitoring, you should keep track of the effort you're putting in. So how often you're monitoring and how long you're doing the surveys for. It doesn't necessarily have to be regular. It depends on what your goals are. Most of us are not interested in publishing studies and scientific journals about window collisions, but still, it's a valid question. Somebody might ask you, how long did you actually check for? Because that can predict how many birds you will find. So just keeping a note in your phone, or you can do printouts. I use for my volunteers a Google form, or I'll just have people fill out the form each time they do a check. It keeps it easy and consolidated. Another option, if you can, is you can collect the birds that you find and stage a layout like Flap does in Toronto. So we did Set Western to produce the photo I showed you earlier. This is a tricky undertaking. And it's really compelling. I'm glad we did it, but a lot of work goes into it. And there's also requirements that you should be aware of. Like you need a specific type of permit to be able to collect migratory birds. It's actually illegal to have birds otherwise. You need a space to store the birds that's central and convenient. And then keeping track of all the birds, like where and when you found them and which species is another issue. You can see we've got labels on all the bags in the freezer. So just keep in mind, if you're going to do this, that there are these sunken costs in effort and time, and do your homework. If you want to learn more about all of that, feel free to reach out to me. Once you have birds, though, you can present that information in a variety of useful ways. And so I've experimented with different types of communications using carcasses like this. These were some of the birds we found in 2019, and you can see I've grouped them by the building they were found at. And this predicted which buildings were going to be the most dangerous ultimately when we were doing checks over multiple years. So really just one way of telling the story. I always like to highlight if we find birds that are species at risk in Ontario, those are of conservation concern. So I recommend identifying them like I have with asterisks here. But then there's also images like the one I showed you. And this is what can really stand out in memory for people, and somebody looking at the last slide, they're quickly going to forget which buildings or even which birds. But this is something I think powerful on a different level. And so much so actually that this picture was incorporated into a book about birds recently. So that was a real thrill for me to see that work included. But yeah, consider that producing images like this through a layout can really tug at people's heartstrings. So now comes the carrot or the stick. And a lot of you are probably familiar with what this means. It refers to this idiom about if you're trying to get a horse or a donkey or another animal to move forward, you can either dangle a carrot in front of them to get them to chase after it, or you can hit them with the stick. So let's start with the carrot. And I recommend starting with the carrot if you can. People tend to respond better to positive pressure than negative. So if you can, always try and frame things positively. So that involves things like reaching out to an administrator, manager, director, whoever's in charge that you've identified through your research. Express your concern, offer to help them. Frame action, so they're retrofitting, as an opportunity to promote environmental sustainability. You want to emphasize the positive aspects. So things like positive publicity, like that it is important to the community. If you can relate what you're asking for to their identity or history or things they've already committed to, that's another way to kind of use their own word against them. So like a lot of universities, for example, have commitments to sustainability. You can point to that and say, hey, you guys said that you're going to be protecting biodiversity. Here's a way for you to do that. And also centering your asks around who the corporation is accountable to. So for some, that might be their customers. For others, that might be students, like on campuses. And we, as students, have a pretty loud collective voice if we get mobilized. So I don't like visuals of animals getting hit with sticks. So I chose something else that I thought was much more appropriate. And it actually is, I think, a better representation of what it's like to throw a book at a bureaucrat. So the stick, you can apply negative pressure. I would be very gentle and careful about this because you don't want to be burning bridges. You don't want people to get the impression that you're scary or not nice and they're not going to want to talk to you, because this is really about, again, building that relationship. So some suggestions are you can place stickers or signs near the problem windows to raise local awareness. You might try relocating bird carcasses you find to near the entrances of the building so that they're harder to ignore. You can try posting pictures on social media and call them out, something I've been known to do. But don't drag them. Don't be overly nasty. Just make it clear that you care and that this is about an opportunity. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. Be very delicate about applying negative pressure and don't be mean. Another way is to start an online petition addressed to management. You might try contacting local news organizations. If you're starting a campaign, those can even be like a student-run newspaper, for example. You could stage an in-person protest at the building. And in all of this, I recommend emphasizing the legal implications as another layer of why they should care. So things like the Endangered Species Act, if bird species at risk are being killed, the Environmental Protection Act or the Migratory Bird Convention Act, saying that, hey, you know, these are laws meant to protect birds, you're breaking the laws. So I just want to give a few visual examples. This is a building that I monitored at Western that has since been retrofitted, and we produced detailed data points for each bird so that the public could click through this Google map and look at the birds. Also taking photos like this, again, really you want to tug at heartstrings. There are these stickers that I designed that you can actually get ordered through Feather Friendly. I'll provide you with a link later. These are just static cling, so you can stick them up on a window. They don't leave behind residue, so you're not vandalizing the property. And that's another great way of producing awareness. I've put up a few that are still there. People haven't noticed them, but I imagine some have, just management hasn't taken them down. Flap Canada has these wonderful new postcards. I've shown the front and back here. You can fill these out and address them to the building manager for a specific address and leave them in the mailbox. Feel free to design versions of this applicable to your community. And then there's also the business of writing letters. So I've developed a few different tools, letter templates that I'll share with you guys. But you can actually use Google Forms online to generate letters that are consistent and thorough, and it reduces the amount of work that you're asking of people in the public that might be willing to send a letter but don't know how to write it themselves. So there's going to be more on this later, but I just wanted to show you an example. I have a letter template generator that will write a detailed letter about birds that you found and then solutions and what you're asking for. For academic institutions, I mentioned reaching out to community. I think if you can align yourself with a group that holds more bargaining chips than you do as an individual, that can be a good strategy. So like if you're a graduate student like me, you know, many schools have a union or a society of graduate students. And you want to specifically find people who are sympathetic to your cause. So folks that care about environmental or sustainability sector issues might be more receptive. So just to give you an anecdote, at Western, I had been advocating for window treatments for quite a while before I approached my student society. And they wrote a letter endorsing what I was asking and sent it to the president of the university. And only after the president heard from them did I get a response letter. And so this is sort of how we got the ball rolling at Western. And I think it's an example of how you can gain momentum by bringing more and more voices into the conversation. So I'm going to move on from talking about corporations to advocating to homeowners. I mentioned that most bird window collisions happen at residential homes. And so arguably, if we want to prevent the most collisions, this is where we really need to double down on concentrating our efforts. So a lot of this is similar, but the tone of the conversation and the steps are going to be different. So of course, we start with identifying goals, scoping, sharing educational resources, and then strategic outreach, and incentivizing participation, because again, you can't force homeowners to do a whole lot. So let's talk about goals. Why are you doing this? Are you talking about a specific home that maybe has big windows and you're concerned? Are you canvassing a street or an entire neighborhood? And what are you going to be talking about? Are you asking them to retrofit their windows? Are you asking them to turn their lights out? Are they letting their cats outside? You want to be very specific in having these goals in mind before you design your advocacy. Are you going to be able and willing to speak to the homeowners directly? So can you, for instance, go to the door and talk to them? Or are you available if you leave them information for them to contact you? And who are you speaking to? So when you knock at a door or send a letter in the mailbox, who is going to be on the receiving end? And consider if there might be social, economic, or cultural factors to consider. Maybe there's people who have a lot else on their plate and treating their windows for saving birds is not high on their priority list. Or maybe there's a language barrier. These are all things you want to be mindful of because you don't really know who you're talking to until you're talking to them. So I mentioned scoping. There are a variety of tools that can assist you with scoping out plans for advocating to homeowners from your couch. So for instance, using Google Street View, you can walk down a street like the middle picture, or you can use Google Earth and actually get a fairly decent view in 3D of homes to give you an indication of the size of the windows. So I've just shown an example. This is a natural area in London, and we're hoping to target information to homeowners surrounding the environmentally significant area because where you have bird habitat, you're going to have a high density of birds, and that's where window collisions might be more frequent. So this kind of background research can be helpful for designing an advocacy approach, but I would be confidential about this. Most people don't respond positively if you tell them, hey, I was just looking at your house on Google Earth. Anyway, so your next step might be to schedule an in-person visit. You can just walk down the street and view homes from that distance. Again, I recommend prioritizing looking at homes near green spaces where window collisions are more frequent, and prioritizing homes, especially in a neighborhood where there aren't any bird-friendly windows yet. You want to maybe target people that are going to be more sympathetic. So if you find houses that have bird feeders or bird houses already on the front lawn, or if you see windows that have existing deterrents that aren't effective, so like a lot of people will go out and buy birds of prey stickers and slap one or two up on the window, that's usually a sign that a bird has hit there and somebody sympathetic in the building cared enough to go and try and fix the problem, unfortunately using the wrong materials. Or if you see houses that have intentionally naturalized landscaping as if they're trying to create habitat, those are people who might be more receptive. If you were to go to them and say, hey, I'm concerned about saving birds, in the neighborhood. These are people who may have more values overlap with you. So in terms of sharing those educational resources, there's a few different ways you can go about it. You can try knocking on the front door of homes to share information in person, or you can always leave materials in the mailbox. So for in-person, you want to proceed with caution. It is a pandemic still, but beyond that, you want to be sure who you're talking to. Are they the homeowner? Are they renting the home? Do they really respond badly to people knocking at their door? You need to be really sensitive to use that approach effectively. For putting information in the mailbox so that the recipient will receive it later, I think that providing a personally signed letter and having a real neighborly tone is the best possible option. Or you can always share a pamphlet or a postcard with relevant information if you have one. And I suggest if doing the latter, try and do something pretty. People are more likely to hold on to things and take them seriously if they look nice. But in general, I recommend you want to leave something behind so that the recipient can return to it later to access more information. So for instance, a lot of people might be like, yeah, sure, that's cool. But then a bird would hit their window within a few months and they'd say, oh, I have something for this. Somebody came and spoke to me about this exact issue. So giving them a pamphlet is one approach, or a magnet or something. Ideally, you want to be able to point them in the direction of more general information. So about bird window collisions, as well as maybe some locally specific information. So where they can go to purchase products to fix their window. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of materials like this. I developed a guide. This is now hosted on the City of London's website. This is just a little summary piece at the beginning. So it's got those core facts, easy to read, really quick, and then the sections of the document about helping birds that are still alive, what to do with dead birds, so reporting, and solutions, got a whole page. And so this is actually just a 2-page document. It's useful online because there's a lot of hyperlinks embedded, but you can also print this and leave it in a mailbox, even on one double-sided sheet. We're actually working on developing a more eye-catching pamphlet. This is still in draft. We're waiting for approval from the City of London Corporate Communications Office. But as you can see, this is much more visually engaging. Kids might be more inclined to read it. And, we're trying ways to make it more interesting. So tying in the official bird for London, which is the cardinal, giving an example of a bird-friendly building in the community, addressing misconceptions like the use of single visual markers. Those are all worthy considerations. And then giving people opportunities to take further action. So other ways of keeping birds friendly, for instance, are put on the last panel. So when you give a pitch, you really want to be sensitive to how am I going to get the audience to care? And you're going to need to kind of adopt a learn as you go approach in most cases. So for me, if I'm starting a conversation with a stranger, you want to identify which aspects of birds is going to resonate the most with them and then expand from that. So you might try talking about, for a homeowner, you could be saving 2 to 10 individual birds' lives per year. That's the average number of birds that can be killed by a single building over the course of a year, according to FLAP. You might stress the ecological importance of birds. So, we're dealing with a lot of invasive species of insects now in the province. Birds are really important for pollination. You could talk about the decline of birds or biodiversity loss or climate change and use statistics to make a case for why this is a severe problem people should be worried about. You might talk about bird migration and the connectivity that birds offer, that the birds that we see here fly south for parts of the year, and we need to make sure that they stay safe so that they can continue on their journeys, make people feel like they're part of something much bigger. Emphasize birds in community. So if there's people in the area that feed birds, if they live near green space, talk about how birds are really important for those features. You can suggest that, it might seem like nothing, but individual actions can actually make a big difference, because if more and more people treat their windows, we're going to collectively save more birds. So empowering people to make individual change. And then even tying in family education. If you get the impression that there are kids at home, say this is a great lesson that you can teach your kids about conservation. You can even turn the window treatment into a crafting activity. So there's lots of different potential angles to take. Really depends on who you're talking to and be willing to basically throw anything in the kitchen sink. I mentioned that we want to identify potential barriers, and I think about those at the individual and community levels. So at the individual level, a single person homeowner who you're trying to convince to treat their windows might be concerned about the cost. They might care about the aesthetics. Maybe they can't install the window treatments themselves because of various reasons, or maybe they don't own the property and they're a renter. At the community level, maybe there aren't stores nearby that sell appropriate products for retrofits. Maybe there's no public education and people just don't know about birds and windows. And maybe there's pressure from the surrounding community for homeowners to conform and maintain a uniform appearance. If you live in a subdivision where all the houses are the same, you know, maybe people are worried that they can't put markers on the window or their house is going to look different from everybody else's. So thinking about these issues in advance, you can prepare follow-up answers to them. I think that most homeowners are more likely to accept the idea of a window treatment at their own home if they see them on other buildings in their community. If they're not the first one, if they're saying, oh yeah, you know, Glennis down the street has already done this and her window doesn't look so bad, you know, it contributes to that normalizing effect that we want to achieve. You want to check beforehand if there are local stores that are selling effective window treatment products. I'm not talking about things like the ultraviolet stickers or birds of prey. I mean things like feather-friendly DIY tape that have been tested and endorsed as effective. I know that Wild Birds Unlimited, many of the stores carry feather-friendly, and Lee Valley Tools is a hardware store that carries them. But in case people ask, oh, where can I get this product? You know, especially seniors might not like the idea of going and ordering it online. So having in mind where they can go in the community is quite important. And another barrier that I think we haven't done a good enough job yet of addressing is ensuring there are contractors that are available and can come treat the window for you. So if you are old, or if you use a wheelchair, or if you don't have time, or if you're afraid of heights, you know, maybe getting on a ladder and treating that window is the biggest barrier of all. And so if you can give people information for a contractor who's familiar with putting up, you know, curtains of cord or can install feather friendly, that can make a big difference. And so starting conversations with contractors in the community might be worthwhile as well. And then the last piece is incentivizing participation. You want to make people feel good about doing good things. And that's also going to, you know, solicit other people to want to feel those good things as well. So creating opportunities for people to share and highlight their contribution and feel appreciated. So sharing photos of bird-friendly windows online. I know a lot of people are already doing that. Sending a small token of appreciation after they've treated a window, like a postcard with a bird on it. Feather Friendly now has stickers that say this glass is bird safe. I really like this idea. I've never seen one before, but what if we had little like yard signs that could go on a property once you've got a bird friendly window up, so that people walking and driving by might see it and say, oh, I never noticed that before. So yeah, just creating more knock-on effects, opportunities for engagement. So now I'm going to talk about advocating to municipal government. And this is where I think a lot of people get stuck. It's quite daunting. So again, start by identifying the goals. You want to recruit allies. You want to organize an advocacy strategy. You want to rally support from the public and constituents. You want to do your homework and do the government's homework too, if you can. So what are the goals? If you want a requirement for bird-friendly stuff, bird-friendly building design in your community, if you want the government to be supporting distributing pamphlets, you know, who specifically is responsible for that? There's usually different offices at the municipal level that oversee different aspects of what we're talking about. Some might be corporate communications, some might be planning. And a related question is, how is all this regulated in your community? So that might be like site plan control bylaw. That's what's used in London. So if we want new site plans in London to include bird-friendly glass, there's a specific office to talk to about that bylaw. Or maybe it's a standard or a set of guidelines. And then what are the applicable policies, plans, or strategies in place? So a lot of municipalities have design policies, or they might have plans for, you know, protecting the environment. Tying it all together in your background research can help a lot. In general, I think it's easier to frame what you're asking your government to do within an existing framework rather than asking them to generate a new one. So if your municipality already has committed to working on climate change or protecting biodiversity in the environment, Aligning the language in your ask and explicitly referencing those commitments can help a lot. And don't reinvent the wheel, because you don't have to. You can tell your municipality that there are others like it, just like the city of Toronto, that have already developed bird-friendly programs and policies that your city can just copy. So you want to recruit allies to your cause, because advocating to a government by yourself is exhausting and kind of Sisyphean, if you ask me. So I recommend starting by aligning yourself with people in the community who are going to be sympathetic, maybe people who care about birds like you, and leverage those connections. Then to approach government, you want to start at the lowest possible level for somebody you talk to say yes, and then work your way up from there. So again, reaching out to people who are likely to be sympathetic to environmental or animal welfare concerns. To give you an example of how that might look, I'll share my own approach in London. So I approached a municipal advisory committee, environmental and ecological planning. I presented to the committee expressing what I wanted. Through that committee, I spoke to city planning staff, and then that gets escalated up to city councillors who serve on different committees that are part of city council. So this is going to look different in every municipality, but working your way up that ladder can be a beneficial approach, just recognizing it is going to take patience and several steps. But the higher up you reach, the more influence and the more insider knowledge you will access that can help you get stuff done. Maintaining relationships with people, especially people in government that are helping you, is really, really important. And so I think good practice is you want to include expressing gratitude for help when you receive it, and sending follow-up emails. If you have a really good meeting or conversation, feel free to drop them a line after and thank them and rehash, just to keep things fresh in mind. So once you have your asks and you know who to talk to, you want to establish a strategy. So that strategy might include a timeline and the mechanism to get where you want to go. So what are the actual steps required to implement the changes? How long is each step going to take? And when and where should you strategically apply pressure? You should expect that municipal projects can take a really long time if they're going through different levels and offices. So just plan for that. And when in doubt, consult local and or internal experts working in government for advice. So these are people who have seen movements like this come and go, people who know, I guess, the vibe of the current government and who is worth talking to, where you might find support. And I recommend aligning a group of supporters and meeting regularly to discuss and to delegate tasks, because again, doing this by yourself is really daunting, and having a group of like-minded people together can provide a lot of continuity. So then comes rallying support from the public. In my experience, generally, politicians are more likely to respond to an ask if they hear about it multiple times from multiple people, and especially from their constituents who voted for them and who they represent. So in a municipality, usually that means the public reaching out to their city councillor for their ward or district. Provincially, that would be their member of provincial parliament, and then federally, you have member of parliament. And the public can express support in a few ways. They can try sending letters to politicians. I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. They might sign your petition. They might amplify your movement on social media, or they might show up for a public demonstration or meeting. So for instance, if you have a new building being put up, proposed in your municipality, maybe somebody shows up at the planning meeting and says, hey, what about bird-friendly glass? So I mentioned writing letters is a big one, and I want to share a tool that I've used, I think, quite effectively recently to streamline the process of getting the public to write letters on your behalf. So this was used for an ongoing campaign to update the building code. There's a movement right now being led by FLAP Canada, and I believe a motion in Parliament still, asking for the building code to be updated to include the CSA standard. But in order for that to actually work, we need more MPPs, members of provincial parliament, to back this. If it comes down to a vote, how many MPPs are going to say, yes, we should do this? And the way that we want to convince MPPs is by having them hear about this from their constituents who voted for them. So we created this little form. It's just a Google form, and I'm going to teach you how to create something like this. But the idea is that people read the description, they fill out these basic questions, and then they're going to be sent a filled email letter template which contains the specific information they provided, so it's personalized, and they can then forward this on to their MPP. So how did we do this? It's in Google Forms, so just Google Forms. If you have a Google account, it should come up. You want to select a blank form, and then you want to fill the form with details from the person that you're going to need for the letter. So that's things like their name, their email address, the recipient's name, so that might be the name of their MPP or counselor, their ward, etc. So if you see here right now, it's on the questions page, but you can click beside that where it says responses. When I took the screenshot, there were 0, but I filled it in. And under responses, you then want to create a spreadsheet with the green button I've shown here. And when you create a spreadsheet, it's going to end up looking like this. So each response you receive is going to be a line. So these are the fields that I put in the form: my neighborhood, my email address, my name. So here's where the fun part starts. You have this spreadsheet of people who've filled out your form. Under extensions, you're going to want to use an add-on. You have to get the add-on first. It's called Document Studio. So just click through the prompt, get add-on, search for Document Studio. And once you have that installed, you open it here. It gets added to the menu, and it'll pull up a panel on the side. And basically what we're going to do is something called mail merge, where we automate sending an email to every line on this sheet. So it'll pull up this menu here. You want to make sure, I think my screen might have frozen. Yeah, so under mail merge with Gmail, you want to make sure that's turned on, and then you're going to click the edit button to access a visual editor. And that pulls up this. So this is where you're actually going to like plug in your letter. So for the email address, it's going to send the email to, in the spreadsheet, if you recall, I put email address in column C. So it's going to add that there. You type in an email subject, and then you type in your email here. You see where you have these brackets? Those are fields that correspond to, again, things in the spreadsheet that people have filled out. So you can add it by just clicking in the bottom corner. Here I've put in my name and my neighborhood. Here's the letter. So you save that. And then to finish and merge, there's another section on the side, and you want to check off this box that says merge on form submit, so that when people press enter and save it, it's going to automatically send a letter to their email instantly. So this is what was produced by that process. Just very basic letter, comes from the email, the Google account that I used. Just remember, when using this tool, you want the letter template to be sent to the person who fills out the form, and then have them forward it to the recipient's email address, so like their MPP. And the reason that's useful is MPPs are going to be quite wary if they're receiving a lot of messages from the same email account, and potentially they might respond. So if you can facilitate a back and forth conversation with the user of the form, that's ideal. You might also want to provide a link for the user of the form to find information about who they should be writing to. So let's say I want to support a project in my municipality. I don't know how to reach my counselor. I don't even know who my counselor is. You can put a hyperlink in the description for the form, and they can just click that, and it'll pull up the name and email address they need to send this off to. Last thing is you want to do your homework, and the government's homework too. So in general, you want to minimize the amount of effort required of the people you're asking for help, staff and politicians. So identifying explicitly resources that are useful, like the CSA 2019 Bird-Friendly Building Design Standard, pointing them to FLAP Canada, which provides support to a lot of governments, as well as identifying other municipalities like Toronto that have already incorporated bird-friendly building design. So again, remind them, hey, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I would suggest seeking key endorsements. So for instance, nature organizations in your community, but even potentially local developing companies, you might reach out to them, their leadership, and say, hey, I want to bring this forward to council, but we want to let them know that the development community is on board with this too. That can just kind of apply some grease and help move the process along. If possible, I recommend submitting a report for review by local government. And that provides an overview of the problem and recommendations. So for instance, earlier this month, I submitted a report for global bird rescue. We had volunteers go out in the City of London, like many other places, and do surveys for bird window collisions. And I submitted our report with the letter on the left to the Planning and Environment Committee for the City of London. The right is the cover letter for the report. So I always like to show pictures of the birds if I can. And so this is the kind of information we included. I'll share my slides with you after, but just very basically the methods that we used to conduct the study, what we found, where they can access our data. So this is a link to the bird mapper and the species we collected. And then of course the recommendations. So what specifically we're asking for, just really spelling it out in good detail and making it very clear, but also not asking them to do a ton of work. And this worked. So this was a notice I received a couple of days ago back from City Council. They adopted a motion so that the asks in our letter, our recommendations, are going to be met. Not immediately, but the process was that the requests were added to what's called the deferred list for the committee. So that means even though they're not talking about it right now, it's been deferred for a later meeting. And that mechanism will ensure it gets followed up on in the future. So, maybe it's 2, 3, 6 months from now, that committee is going to say, hey, what about the bird friendly stuff? Have staff completed that yet? So I think there is value to this approach, and I've demonstrated it has worked in London. I just want to add that municipalities have tons of avenues to help you amplify and promote public education. This was a collaboration we did in London where we got a page in the waste collection calendar that gets sent out to every single home to include information about bird window collisions. So I encourage you to explore opportunities for those kinds of collaborations with your network of community partners, but also with the government. And you can support government communications by giving them ideas and potentially generating or reviewing content from an expert lens. So that's my presentation. I feel like I may have talked too fast a lot. I intend to post these slides online. And these are actually hyperlinks to some of the tools that I've talked about. So for instance, if you like the stop sign decals that I showed, you can actually order those from Feather Friendly. They're generously producing them at no cost and they can be sent to you, as well as a variety of letter template generators that I've created. So look out for a link to access these materials. And if you want to talk to me, if you've got questions or ideas, I can always be reached by email or on Twitter. I always like talking to people interested in birds and bird window collisions. So yeah, drop me a line. And that's all I've got. I think I'm just under an hour, but I'm looking forward to taking questions. Thanks.
That was amazing, Brendon. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we'll open it up for questions, and does anybody have any questions? Feel free to just chime in or ask it in the chat or raise your hand, whatever works.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah, what fuel for activists here. I'm sure everybody wants to do at least one of the things you've listed. And I think what's awesome here is that, you have people with different skills and different interests who can tackle like any part of this huge tree of options. It sounds like you're managing all of them somehow. Like, what kind of team do you have behind you? How many people would you say it's taken to get where you are?
So that's how to answer that. Thank you. That's very generous praise. There have been people contributing to this work before I even started. So there were professors, for instance, at Western who were aware that birds were crashing into building windows, but didn't have the time or space or capacity to advocate like I have. And so they were able to help me align with contexts that I needed. There have been people interested in preventing window collisions in the local government outside of my work as well. And so connecting with those people has helped a lot. But in terms of the core people who helped me, I've had a variety of different undergraduate volunteers and grad students at Western help with doing the building surveys and staging a layout. I get a lot of help even just from the campus community, people sending me reports of birds they find. We've got the Bird Friendly London team, so they're available for a lot of consulting if I have questions or want feedback on things. But in general, most of like the graphic design and content generation stuff has been me. It's definitely a niche. And I don't know, like I have to be mindful that like not everybody has the space or bandwidth to do what I do. I don't want to toot my own horn too loudly or anything, but I'm always willing to, I guess, share the work I've done and make it so that these are not just tools at my disposal, that we're really putting them in the hands of people who are affecting change everywhere.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I might have jumped in front of the queue. I don't know if anybody else has questions.
I think you started the queue, so you're good.
Okay.
I have a question, but I'll wait to see if anyone else has one before I chime in as well. Okay, I'll ask my question. I liked your idea, as we saw in the chat too, others thought so too, about your yard sign idea, you know, kind of making the ease of the whole process advertised to other people. Hey, I did it, you can do it too. And I'm thinking about how that can not only be applied at, you know, the suburban level between residents, but also between architects and contractors. So I'm curious, while a literal picket fence sign might work for Gladys at house 1 and Jeffrey at house 2, what do you think is the best way to do that at a higher level when you have these contractors and architects that have this vision, and the vision is in motion of what they're going to build, especially if it's a multi-unit contract where, you know, we're going to make this apartment complex here, and then in the next town we're building this apartment building. How to basically just make it tangible for them to say to their other partners, we did it. It actually was very easy when we built this building. I would take their word for it. Like, how do you make that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not exactly sure how it ties to the yard sign idea. That seems to be kind of two separate thoughts, but I guess the central purpose is advertising success. You know, I did it, you can do it too. So I didn't talk much about advocating to developers and architects. I was already a long presentation and I wasn't sure how much interest there would be in that here. But there are a variety of different ways to go about it. In general, the principles are the same. You want it to be positive, you want to do the work for them, make it really easy, and give them opportunities to show off and stoke their ego a little bit. For convincing them, you know, I like to point to authorities in their world that have already backed this. So like the Ontario Architects Association, for example, has put out a formal position on bird-friendly building design. They completely support it. You know, maybe the municipality already has language about encouraging bird-friendly design, even if it's not required. So pointing to that, there's also programs like LEAD that include credits for bird-friendly design that might be important on certain levels. But in terms of getting them to celebrate actions already taken, I know that companies that do offer bird-friendly glass, like feather-friendly, for instance, as retrofit materials, can provide little plaques that can go on the window on the building so that visitors will see this is a certified bird-friendly building. I'm actually working on developing a kind of certification for wildlife-friendly buildings in London. So if companies check off enough boxes of our criteria to make their property wildlife friendly, then they're going to get a little plaque from us or a little sign that can go on the property. There might be other ways of amplifying. So, you know, interviewing them and publishing blog posts with the people who oversaw a project, and then sending that out to others in the development community. Just really, I guess, offering a lot of praise and maybe opportunities for addressing some of those barriers. So asking them questions like, you know, was it too expensive? Was it difficult? Just to dispel any hesitation from your audience. But I think FLAP probably has more experience in this space than I do. They deal with architects more than I have. I do think though, when it costs money, your better bet is to require them to do it than expect them to do it on goodwill.
Yeah, thank you. That makes total sense. And I guess that's what segues into the kind of, as you discussed, making it as easy as possible for them to fulfill those requirements.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, hey, you got to check off 3 sustainability boxes for your development. This could be one of them, and it's a very easy one to check off.
Yeah. And you can frame it in useful ways too. Like if you talk about the total cost of a construction project, and then you say, this is how much bird-friendly glass would cost, and this is the percentage, it's usually tiny. It's like decimal points. And so framing it in that way to say, can you adjust the budget ever so slightly, can be, I think, a valuable approach too. But it's all about identifying those barriers in advance and coming prepared with answers.
Yeah, does like a budget flyer exist to kind of say like, hey, this is like the rough estimate of what it would cost, but I guess it's going to vary based off of the development and everything.
We've experimented with developing tools for that purpose, where people can like enter specifications for their window or their building, and then we ask them, okay, what type of product do you want? And then it spits out a quote. But as you said, it's so variable. It really depends on a host of factors. And so I think a better priority is to align them with resources that they can reach out to. If they need to get a quote from a glass company, or if they want to do a risk assessment, that might be a more secure way of getting that information to them. Because you also don't want to like tell them it's going to cost this much, and then it ends up costing way more. Being realistic is important for trust.
Awesome, thanks. And yeah, great follow-up comment by Dave in the chat for that. Does anyone else have any questions? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, if nobody else has any questions, I can jump back in. We're in the process now of trying to bring Guelph up to speed for the Bird Friendly Cities application.
Well done.
I'm wondering from your perspective, how good was that at mobilizing like support within the city? And was it, I guess what I'm wondering right now is whether it's actually motivating cities to move up in levels, or if it's just categorizing them in terms of you're in this bin versus another.
How to concisely answer that question? I feel like I'd be better served to drive to Guelph and just have a beer with you sometime and rant about the Bird Friendly Cities program for 4 hours. But anyway, yeah, sure. I'll give you my Spark Notes version. In general, I think it's a great program. I support it. It's very new and fresh, and there's still, I think, some kinks to be worked out. A lot of good work is happening within individual municipalities. I feel like there's room to grow in the way of getting these groups to interact more and share best practices and resources. From my experience in London was already a very bird-friendly place, to be honest. And so when we applied for certification, we already achieved the high-level ranking from Nature Canada in every category because of stuff that was already here. We just had to take inventory of it. And so I worried a bit about that because there's meaningful work yet to be done. And I didn't want the municipality to be patting themselves on the back and be like, we did it, we saved all the birds. Like, no, you're missing the point. Yeah. I think also, for the longest time before, I felt like there's that dead bird guy on the news again, complaining, rattling a bird around, asking for bird-friendly glass. And a lot of the pressure was removed when you can advocate as part of something larger, when you say, this is bird-friendly London now, and we all care about birds and conserving birds and support these steps. And so I do think it strengthens the advocacy if you can put a name behind it. The other merits of the program, though, from Nature Canada in the way of like promoting crosstalk and amplifying and all that, I think we're going to see a lot of growth in that space in the next year. It's still very much a pilot program, but it's been a lot of fun. We've had many opportunities to do good work that we wouldn't otherwise have without that bird team. Yeah. If you ever want to see what like our work is like, you're welcome to join one of our monthly meetings.
Yeah. Yep. Would love to.
Alternatively, Angela, we could go for a road trip to London and meet up with Brendon.
I like the name better.
Hey,
I'll show you all our bird-friendly windows here.
awesome. Yeah, bird-friendly window tour.
I've thought about doing that as an event. Might be fun.
Hmm.
We're putting together a map of prominent bird-friendly windows in public. It's tricky to do with private home windows, but I think, like I said, people are really motivated by being able to see stuff, especially if they're concerned about aesthetics. It's nice that they can just like walk over and see a building in their neighborhood that's already bird-friendly, and I think it puts a lot of fears at ease and creates that normal.
Okay, Nicole's hand's up.
Yeah, just on that note, Brendon, I noticed Western Sustainability Club, so their undergrad student club, does sustainable tours now. So they're going around campus showing here are recycling locations. And I'm wondering maybe that would be a really good tour for them, is to go around campus and show all these retrofits.
I'm familiar with the Green Tours program. They wanted me to be offering those, and I actually just don't have time. But I've been chatting with the people who run them, and they do actually mention bird-friendly glass on their tours, as I understand it. They don't have dedicated tours, but as of next year, Western will have 5, soon to be 6 bird-friendly buildings on campus.
Nice.
Which I believe is among the most of any institution in the province. So yeah, there's a lot to be proud of there.
Oh, that's awesome.
Does anybody have any other questions? If not, Brendon, it's been great. Thank you so much for such an informative and useful presentation, and everything you've done really is inspiring and genuinely impressive, the mark you've made in the province. So well done. But yeah, it would be great to meet up sometime and we could brainstorm some things for Guelph, hear more about what you do, and tell you more about Bird Safe Guelph. So we should definitely put that on our agenda for the future.
Yeah, please. I would enjoy that a lot.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Brendon, thank you so much. Yeah, we'll talk to you all soon. We're going to have our next talk is Dr. Bridget Stutchbury, and it's, I think, just around the corner in 2 weeks. So stay tuned for that.
All right. Have a great evening, everybody. See you.